The great hall felt too small for so much failure. Torchlight flickered against stone walls that had witnessed 3 centuries of mating challenges, but never one like this. Never this many attempts, this much desperation hanging thick as smoke in the air. Mira pressed herself against the cold back wall, tucked between 2 other Omegas whose names she'd never been permitted to learn. The silver pendant at her throat felt impossibly heavy. 23 women had stepped into the challenge circle today. 23 had walked back out, heads bowed, while the magical barrier protecting their territory grew thinner with each rejection. Myra's simple blue dress, fine but deliberately modest, was damp with the nervous sweat of witnessing so much failure. She shouldn't even be watching. Omegas were meant to prepare the ceremonial space, then disappear like morning mist, invisible, unheard, forgotten the moment their usefulness ended. Yet something fierce clawed at the inside of her ribs. Her wolf, the wild consciousness she'd learned to silence before it could get her beaten or exiled, was no longer pacing. It was screaming. The sensation burned behind her breastbone like swallowed lightning, demanding she move forward when everything she'd been taught commanded her to shrink back. The shields failing, an Omega named Senna breathed beside her, voice barely audible beneath the murmuring crowd. Elder Thorn said it's down to 10%. She didn't finish the thought. She didn't need to. No true mate meant no completed bond. No bond meant the moon's shield, the ancient magic woven into their land by the first alpha and his destined partner, would shatter completely. The rival packs, the rogue territories, the wild magic storms that swept through unprotected lands, all of it would descend on them like wolves on wounded prey. Mira said nothing. Speaking was a luxury Omegas couldn't afford, not when words from their mouths were treated as theft of air better used by higher ranks. But her fingers moved unconsciously to her collarbone, tracing the outline of the mark hidden beneath her pendant and dress. The mark of the lunar key. A stylized crescent moon burned into her skin since her first shift, elegant as silver ink and dangerous as a loaded weapon. Hide it, Mira, her mother had whispered the night before she died, pressing the pendant into her daughter's palm. The prophecy says the key will save us or doom us. Until you know which, let them think you're nothing. So Mira had become nothing. A shadow in the kitchens. A silent presence in the serving lines. She'd swallowed every thought, every observation, every moment of seeing what others missed, until invisibility became her armor and silence became her only protection. From her position at the back, she could see everything. The challenge circle dominated the hall's center, its stones carved with lunar phases that should have been glowing but sat dark and cold. Beyond it, on the raised platform, stood the Council of Elders, their ceremonial robes unable to hide how fear had bent their shoulders. And beside them stood Alpha Garrickvoss. Even exhausted, even radiating the kind of bone-deep frustration that came from watching his pack's destruction draw closer with each failed attempt, he was overwhelming. Broad-shouldered and battle-scarred, wrapped in the fur cloak of leadership, he carried authority like other men carried weapons. The Moonfire brand on his forearm, visible even from this distance, should have been blazing with recognition when his true mate approached. Instead, it lay dark and dormant, mocking him. Mira had always been sensitive to emotions, reading the undercurrents others missed. An Omega survival skill, know the mood of the room, anticipate the blow before it lands. Right now, the Alpha's desperation tasted like ash on her tongue, bitter and choking. His failure wasn't just political. It was personal, visceral, the kind of defeat that carved pieces from a man's soul. That was the last eligible beta, Elder Thorn announced, his ancient voice cracking. The new moon rises in 3 days. If the Alpha cannot complete his bond by then, the moon's shield falls. Our territory, our pack, everything our ancestors built, it ends. The crowd erupted in frightened whispers. Pack law was absolute. Only betas and alphas could attempt the mating challenge. Omegas weren't even considered wolves in the traditional sense, more like pack servants who happened to shift. But Mira felt the mark beneath her pendant begin to burn. She watched as Garrick turned to Elder Thorn, saw his jaw clench as he prepared to speak words that might doom them all. The moonfire brand on his arm flickered, just once, so faintly she thought she'd imagined it. Then it flickered again, stronger this time, pulling his attention toward the back of the hall. Pulling his attention toward her. Myra's heart hammered against her ribs. The lunar key mark blazed beneath her clothing, hot enough to make her gasp. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to remain the invisible nothing she'd perfected. But her wolf was done being silent. And the moon's shield was dying. Before fear could stop her, before reason could intervene, Mira heard her own voice, quiet but clear in the sudden silence, ring through the great hall. I can do it. Chapter 1. The hall went silent. Not the comfortable quiet of contemplation, but the shocked, airless silence that followed blasphemy. Every head turned toward the back wall where Mira stood, her voice still echoing off ancient stone like a thrown gauntlet. Alpha Garrick Voss froze mid-turn, his massive frame going rigid as though struck by lightning. The moonfire brand on his forearm erupted with sudden light, blue-white and searingly bright, forcing him to hiss through clenched teeth. His eyes, dark and dangerous, swept across the crowd until they locked onto her. Mira felt the impact of that gaze like a physical blow. For a heartbeat, she almost retreated back into the shadows, back into the safety of being no one. But the lunar key mark beneath her pendant was burning so hot she thought it might brand through her dress, and her wolf, her wild, desperate wolf, pushed her forward. One step, then another. The Omegas beside her shrank back as though she carried plague. The crowd parted without thinking, bodies instinctively clearing a path they would never have consciously granted someone of her rank. Mira walked through that corridor of shocked faces, her simple blue dress suddenly feeling like ceremonial armor. Each step toward the challenge circle was a step away from everything she'd ever been taught, every rule that had kept her safe and small and invisible. Stop. The command cracked through the hall like a whip. Lead Beta Alara descended from the platform with predatory grace, her ceremonial red cloak, marking her as first among the betas, billowing behind her like war flags. She was everything Mira wasn't, tall, powerful, born to leadership. Her father sat on the Elder Council. Her bloodline traced back 6 generations of pack champions. And right now, her beautiful face was twisted with fury. This is rank insolence, Alara announced, her voice pitched to carry to every corner of the hall. An Omega dares to speak in the sacred challenge? To claim rights she cannot possibly possess. She turned to the council, one elegant hand gesturing dismissively at Mira. Elder Thorn, I demand immediate banishment for this. Creature's presumption. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Pack law was clear. Omegas served. They did not challenge. They certainly did not step into ceremonies meant for their betters. But Elder Thorn wasn't looking at Alara. He was staring at Alpha Garrick, whose moonfire brand was still blazing with light that cast dancing shadows across the hall. The old man's face had gone pale as winter snow. Alpha. Alara's voice sharpened when Garrick didn't respond. Surely you won't allow this mockery to continue? Garrick took a step forward. Then another. His massive frame cut through the space between them like a ship through water, pack members scrambling out of his path. The brand on his arm pulsed with each step, growing brighter as the distance between him and Mira shrank. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that Mira could see the scars crossing his jaw, the exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes, the way his chest rose and fell with breaths that seemed too fast for a man who faced down enemy packs without flinching. Look at me, he said, his voice low and rough. Mira lifted her chin, meeting his gaze. Protocol demanded she lower her eyes, bow her head, show submission to her alpha. But something ancient and undeniable was stirring in her blood, and she found she couldn't look away even if she wanted to. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Mira watched recognition flicker across his face, not of her, exactly, but of something in her. Something that answered the desperate question his Moonfire brand had been asking with every failed challenge. The mark beneath her pendant blazed hotter. Her hand moved without conscious thought to press against it, and she saw his eyes track the movement, saw the exact moment he understood what lay hidden beneath her clothing. "You cannot seriously be considering this." Alara's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "She's an Omega. She can't fight. She has no strategic training. She would fail before the first trial even began, and we would lose 3 days we don't have." Her tone gentled, became almost pleading. "Alpha, I know you're desperate, but this is madness." Garrick's jaw clenched. Mira could feel the war happening inside him, duty against instinct, law against the undeniable pull of the brand that was still casting blue light across both their faces. "My Alpha," Elder Thorn's reedy voice broke the standoff. "The law states that any unmated wolf may attempt the challenge. It does not, technically, specify rank. Because our ancestors never imagined an Omega would be foolish enough to try." Alara's composure was cracking, real fear bleeding through her anger. "This is a perversion of everything I accept her challenge." The words fell like stones into still water. Garrick hadn't looked away from Mira, hadn't broken their locked gaze. When he spoke again, his voice carried the full weight of Alpha command that could not be questioned, could not be denied. "Mira of the Crescent Moon Pack will face the mating challenge at dawn tomorrow. Any who object may bring their concerns to me privately." His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "If they dare." The hall erupted into chaos. But Mira barely heard it. She was caught in Garrick's gaze, in the intensity of eyes that looked at her like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking his entire life. Like she was visible. Like she was real. Like she was enough. Chapter 2. Dawn came too quickly and not quickly enough. Mira had spent the night in a small preparation chamber off the Great Hall, unable to sleep, unable to think of anything beyond the weight of what she'd done. The other Omegas who should have helped her prepare had refused to enter, leaving her alone with ceremonial robes she barely knew how to fasten and a mind that wouldn't stop racing. Now she stood in the challenge circle as the first light crept through the hall's high windows, turning the stone floor silver. The carved lunar phases beneath her feet remained dark and cold, a reminder of how close they all stood to annihilation. The hall filled slowly. Pack members filed in with hushed voices and sideways glances, taking positions along the walls as though afraid to come too close to what was either salvation or catastrophe. Mira kept her hands clasped in front of her, hiding their trembling, the silver pendant at her throat catching the morning light. Elder Thorn entered first, moving with the careful steps of someone carrying a burden too heavy for ancient bones. Behind him came the other council members, their faces carved from disapproval and poorly concealed fear. Then Alara, her red cloak immaculate, her expression carefully neutral in a way that made Myra's instincts scream warnings. Finally, Alpha Garrick. He wore the full ceremonial armor of leadership, silver inlaid leather across his chest, the fur cloak of his station, weapons that were both symbolic and deadly. But it was his face that held Myra's attention. The exhaustion from yesterday had deepened, carved fresh lines around his eyes, as though he too had spent the night wrestling with impossible choices. The Moonfire brand on his exposed forearm looked angry, the edges of the mark raised and reddened like a fresh burn. "We begin with the rite of sacred water," Elder Thorn announced, his voice stronger than his frame suggested possible. "The challenger must retrieve the blessed water from the deep spring and present it to the Alpha without spilling a single drop. It tests steadiness, focus, and respect for tradition." A young Beta stepped forward with a silver cup, placing it on a small altar at the circle's edge. Mira recognized the test. She'd prepared this very water dozens of times for other ceremonies, had cleaned this same cup until it gleamed. The deep spring lay 3 levels below the great hall, down steep stone stairs worn smooth by centuries of feet. She'd never been allowed to actually participate in the rite, only to serve it. Mira bowed her head in acknowledgement and turned toward the doorway that led down. Behind her, she heard Alara's voice, pitched low but meant to carry. She'll never make it back up those stairs. Omegas don't have the strength for the climb with a full cup. Myra's jaw tightened, but she kept walking. Down through passages lit by guttering torches. Down past the pack's living quarters, past the storage chambers, past the training rooms, until she reached the cavern where the deep spring bubbled up from stone, its water so cold it hurt to touch. The silver cup sat waiting on the altar beside the spring. Mira filled it with hands that had stopped trembling, focusing on the task the way she'd focused on every other impossible thing she'd survived. One moment at a time. One breath at a time. The climb back was agony. The cup was heavier than it should have been, as though the water itself knew the weight of what rode on this moment. Her arms burned. Her legs shook. But she'd carried heavier loads through longer nights, invisible in the kitchens while her betters feasted and forgot her existence. She emerged into the great hall without having spilled a drop. The watching pack members shifted, surprise rippling through them like wind across water. Mira crossed the challenge circle and stopped before Garrick, the cup held steady between them. His dark eyes met hers, and for just a heartbeat, she saw something that might have been respect. "Alpha," she said quietly, offering the sacred water. Garrick reached for the cup. His fingers brushed hers. The moonfire brand exploded with light. Garrick jerked back, with a strangled sound between a gasp and a snarl, his free hand clutching at his forearm where the mark blazed blue-white and searing. The light was so bright Mira had to squint against it, so intense she could feel the heat radiating from where they'd touched. Pain lanced through her own collarbone, sharp, burning, undeniable. She flinched, her hand flying to her pendant as the lunar key mark beneath it flared in response. For 3 heartbeats, blue light shone through the fabric of her ceremonial robes, illuminating the stylized crescent moon branded into her skin. The great hall went deathly silent. Elder Thorn made a sound like a man who'd been gutted. His face drained of all color as he stared at Myra's collarbone, where the light was already fading back beneath her clothing. His lips moved wordlessly before he found his voice. "The dual marks," he whispered. Then louder, with the weight of prophecy and terror combined, "the moonfire and the lunar key. The true bond." The council members erupted into frantic whispers. Pack members pressed closer, trying to see, trying to understand what had just been revealed. Myra's hand remained pressed to her pendant, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Garrick was staring at her with an expression she couldn't read, shock and recognition, and something that might have been fear warring across his scarred face. "Impossible," Alara's voice cut through the chaos, but there was something different in it now. Something sharp and calculating. She moved closer to the circle's edge, her eyes fixed on where Myra's mark had briefly shone. The prophecy speaks of the dual marks, yes, but it also speaks of the curse. The risk of absolute failure, Elder Thorn finished, his voice hollow. He turned to face the crowd, and Mira saw her fate written in the terror on his ancient face. The prophecy states that the moonfire and lunar key, when united, will either forge an unbreakable shield or shatter everything. If they fail to complete the bond, if even one trial has failed, the backlash won't just destroy the moon shield. It will destroy the pack itself. The whispers turned to frightened murmurs. Mira felt the weight of every eye in the hall, felt the shift from shock to fear to something darker. She wasn't just an Omega overstepping anymore. She was a loaded weapon pointed at everything they loved. Alara's expression had transformed from anger to cold assessment. When her eyes met Myra's across the circle, there was a new understanding there. A recognition of genuine threat. And beneath it, the calculation of someone planning how to eliminate that threat entirely. Garrick finally moved, lowering his arm though the brand still glowed faintly. When he spoke, his voice carried absolute authority. "Then we don't fail." He took the cup from Myra's trembling hands and drank the sacred water in one long swallow, his eyes never leaving hers. When he finished, he set the cup aside and offered her his hand, his right hand, where the moonfire brand still pulsed with residual light. "We continue," he said. At sunset, the second trial. Mira looked at his offered hand, at the mark that matched her own, at the choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Behind him, Elder Thorn looked like he might be sick. Beside him, Alara smiled, but it was the smile of a hunter who'd just spotted prey. Mira took Garrick's hand. The marks flared again, bright and burning and binding. And somewhere in the distance, the moon's shield flickered like a dying star. Chapter 3. Sunset painted the great hall in shades of blood and amber. Mira stood once more in the challenge circle, acutely aware of how the light caught the silver pendant at her throat, how every eye tracked her smallest movement. The morning's revelation had transformed her from curiosity to catastrophe. She could taste their fear in the air, metallic and sharp, like lightning about to strike. The Alpha Council assembled on the platform with deliberate ceremony, their faces carved from stone and judgment. At their center sat Counselor Dane, Alara's father, his ceremonial robes doing nothing to soften the hardness in his eyes. He was a man who'd spent 40 years consolidating power, and Mira represented everything he couldn't control. "The second trial," Dane announced, his voice carrying the weight of ancient authority. By tradition and necessity, the Alpha's mate must prove her worth in combat. She must demonstrate the strength to defend the pack, the skill to lead warriors, the power to stand beside our Alpha in battle. He leaned forward, and Mira caught the cruel satisfaction in his expression. "I propose a trial by combat. The challenger will face 3 of our finest fighters in succession." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembled pack. Myra's stomach dropped. She had no combat training. Omegas weren't taught to fight, they were taught to survive through invisibility and service. 3 trained warriors would destroy her before the first trial even truly began. "No." Garrick's voice cut through the hall like a blade. Dane's eyebrows rose. "Alpha, surely you don't object to testing your potential mate's ability to." "I object to rigging trials to guarantee failure." Garrick descended from the platform, his movements controlled but radiating barely leashed fury. The moonfire brand on his arm pulsed with each step, responding to something Mira couldn't quite name. "The mating challenge tests compatibility, not conformity. My mate needs wisdom, not just weapons." With respect, Alpha, Dane's tone suggested no respect whatsoever. The pack requires strength. "We face enemies who won't care about wisdom when they're tearing through our borders." Garrick stopped at the circle's edge, his jaw tight. Mira watched him wrestle with something internal, saw the exact moment when understanding flickered across his face. His hand moved unconsciously to his forearm, pressing against the glowing mark. When he spoke again, his voice was calmer, more certain. "Then we test the strength that matters. The second trial will assess strategic thinking, knowledge of pack history, and ability to read the needs of our people." He turned to face the council directly. "An Alpha's mate must understand what she protects. Show me she doesn't." The challenge hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Dane's face darkened, but he couldn't object without admitting he'd rather have a mate who could fight than one who could think. Several council members shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the trap Garrick had laid. "Very well," Dane said finally, each word clipped. "Elder Thorn will administer the trial of knowledge." The ancient elder stepped forward with a heavy leather tome, its pages yellow with age. He set it on a small table within the circle, then produced 3 sealed scrolls. "The challenger will answer 3 questions. The first tests memory of our laws. The second tests strategic thinking. The third," he hesitated, his watery eyes finding Myra's face, "tests the heart." Mira approached the table, her pulse thundering in her ears. Years of invisibility had taught her to listen, to observe, to remember everything because knowledge was the only currency an Omega could hoard. She'd spent countless hours in the pack library, finding refuge in histories and records while others ignored her existence. She just hoped it had been enough. Elder Thorn broke the first seal. Recite the Covenant of Territory, the original words, not the common version, and explain its significance to our current crisis. Mira closed her eyes, pulling the memory from years ago when she'd found the original covenant in a crumbling manuscript. Where the moon's light touches earth, there the pack holds dominion, bound by blood and blessed by bond. No alpha may claim the land alone, nor may any mate be chosen by pride. The shield rises only when two marks unite as one. She opened her eyes. It means the moon's shield was never meant to be sustained by alpha dominance alone. It requires partnership. Balance. The original magic demands both marks, both the moonfire and whatever mark the mate carries. Shocked silence filled the hall. Even Dane looked taken aback. Elder Thorn's hands trembled slightly as he broke the second seal. The Serpent Pass is under attack by 3 separate enemy forces. You have 60 warriors, limited supplies, and conflicting intelligence about which force is strongest. How do you respond? Mira didn't hesitate. This was the kind of problem she'd solved 100 times in the kitchens: limited resources, competing demands, no margin for error. You don't fight 3 battles. You force them to fight each other. Send 20 warriors to hold the most defensible position while making it look like your full force. Use supply movements to suggest your main camp is in the east, drawing the 2 largest forces toward each other. When they engage, you hit the 3rd force with overwhelming numbers, then use their supplies and position to fortify before the other 2 realize they've been manipulated. She caught Garrick staring at her, something like wonder in his dark eyes. Around the hall, warriors were nodding slowly, recognizing the brutal efficiency of the strategy. Elder Thorn's hand shook harder as he reached for the 3rd scroll. When he broke the seal, his face went pale. This question. He started, then seemed to reconsider. The pack is starving. You have food enough for either the warriors who defend the borders, or the children who represent the future. Choose. The hall went deathly quiet. It was an impossible question, designed to have no right answer. Mira felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders, felt every eye waiting to judge her choice. She thought of all the times she'd gone hungry so others could eat. All the times she'd stretched supplies through creativity rather than abundance. All the ways Omegas survived by seeing what others missed. You're asking the wrong question, Mira said quietly. A leader who sees only 2 choices has already failed. You feed both. You hunt differently, preserve differently, ration differently. You send the strongest warriors to hunt while the injured defend. You teach the oldest children to help gather and prepare food. You make everyone part of the solution instead of forcing some to be the sacrifice. She met Elder Thorn's eyes. Strength isn't choosing who suffers. It's making sure no one has to. The silence that followed felt different. Heavier. Mira could feel something shifting in the hall, in the way pack members looked at her. Not quite acceptance, but not dismissal either. Something closer to reluctant respect. Ilara stood near the back, her face carefully blank. But Myra's empathic senses caught something else, a spike of rage so sharp it tasted like copper on her tongue. She watched as Ilara leaned close to a broad-shouldered beta, whispering something urgent in his ear. The beta nodded once and slipped toward the side exit. She passes, Elder Thorn announced, his voice barely steady. The trial of intellect is complete. Garrick crossed the circle in 3 strides and took Myra's hand. The marks flared again, that now familiar burning that felt less like pain and more like recognition. Tomorrow, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The final trial. The path of the ancestors at dawn. But Mira was barely listening. She was watching the doorway where the beta had disappeared, feeling the wrongness of it crawl across her skin like ice. Ilara smiled at her from across the hall. And Mira knew, with the certainty of prey sensing a predator, that the real test was about to begin. Chapter 4. The kitchens were abandoned at this hour, the fires banked low, the great tables scrubbed clean and gleaming in the dim light. Mira moved through the familiar space like a ghost returning home, her feet knowing every loose stone, every uneven patch of floor. After the scrutiny of the hall, the judgment of hundreds of eyes, she'd needed somewhere she could breathe. She'd forgotten that familiar places could hide new dangers. "You must be exhausted." The voice came from the shadows near the cold storage. A servant emerged. Mira recognized her vaguely, a woman who worked the night shifts, someone whose name she'd never learned because Omegas weren't supposed to matter to each other. "I brought you something. A calming tonic. You'll need your rest before tomorrow." The woman held out a small clay cup, its contents dark and herb-scented. She smiled, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. Myra's empathic awareness flared like touching a hot coal. The emotion radiating from the servant wasn't concern or kindness, it was fear laced with guilty determination. The acrid taste of it filled Myra's mouth, unmistakable and wrong. "That's very kind," Mira said carefully, not reaching for the cup. "But I'm not thirsty. You should drink it." The woman's smile strained. "Really? It will help you sleep." The insistence confirmed what Myra's instincts were screaming. She took a step back, angling toward the kitchen's main entrance. "Who told you to bring this to me?" Something flickered across the servant's face, relief, maybe, that she wouldn't have to maintain the pretense. "Does it matter? You're going to get us all killed." That prophecy, the curse, everyone knows what happens if the dual marks fail. Better one Omega dies than the whole pack. The cup trembled in the woman's hand, liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. She wasn't a killer by nature, Mira realized. Just someone terrified enough to become one. "I understand your fear," Mira said quietly, still backing toward the door. "But poisoning me won't save the pack. It will just guarantee the moon shield falls. At least it would fall clean. Not take us all down with." "Mira." Garrick's voice from the doorway made them both freeze. He filled the entrance, still in his ceremonial armor, the moonfire brand visible and faintly glowing. His dark eyes took in the scene with predatory speed, Myra's defensive posture, the servant's guilty panic, the cup clutched in shaking hands. The temperature in the kitchen seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Give me the cup," Garrick said, his voice soft and more terrifying for it. The servant's face crumbled. She set the cup on the nearest table and fled, her footsteps echoing frantically down the corridor. Garrick watched her go, then turned his attention to the abandoned tonic. He didn't touch it, but Mira saw his jaw clench. "How did you know?" he asked finally. I could feel her fear. Her guilt. Mira wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the banked fires. "It's an Omega skill. We learn to read emotions because our survival depends on anticipating danger." Garrick looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. "Come with me," he said. "There's something you need to see." He led her through corridors she'd never walked before, past the Alpha's personal chambers to a small study lined with ancient texts. A single lamp burned on a heavy wooden desk, casting warm light across scattered papers and one particular leather-bound book, its pages open to an illuminated manuscript. "This is the original prophecy," Garrick said, gesturing to the book. "Not the version the council preaches. The complete text." Mira approached slowly, her eyes scanning the faded script and intricate drawings. She saw the dual marks illustrated in painful detail, the moonfire brand and the lunar key, connected by flowing lines that suggested both harmony and collision. "It speaks of the curse," she said softly, finding the passage. "United, they forge unbreakable bonds or shatter all that stands. There is no middle ground, no partial victory. Completion or catastrophe." "My father bore the moonfire brand," Garrick said, his voice rough. "When I was 12, he attempted the path of the ancestors with a mate the council had chosen for him. Someone strong, skilled, perfectly qualified." He moved to the window, staring out at the darkness. She didn't have a matching mark. The path collapsed beneath them. "My father survived. She didn't. And the moon shield weakened permanently from that failed attempt." Mira heard the weight of old trauma in his words, felt the echo of a child's terror wrapped around a man's guilt. You were there. I watched him fall. Watched him crawl from the rubble carrying her body. Garrick's hand clenched against the window frame. He never forgave himself. Died 5 years later, and everyone said it was pack politics, but I knew better. He couldn't live with what the shield's magic had cost. The confession hung between them, raw and real. Mira understood suddenly why Garrick had frozen when she'd first stepped forward, why he'd fought the council so hard to change the trial. He wasn't just afraid of losing another mate. He was afraid of becoming his father. I'm terrified, Mira heard herself say. The words escaped before she could cage them, but once started, she couldn't stop. Not of the path. Not of falling or dying. I'm afraid the prophecy is right, that I'm not strong enough to use the Lunar Key's power correctly, and my failure will be what destroys everything. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I've spent my whole life being told I'm worthless. What if they're right? What if the mark chose wrong? Garrick turned from the window, closing the distance between them in 2 strides. He took her hands in his, and the marks flared, not painfully this time, but warm, steady, like a heartbeat finding its rhythm. The mark doesn't choose wrong, he said, his voice certain in a way that made something in Myra's chest crack open. I've felt you through this bond, Mira. Your strength isn't loud or obvious, but it's there, in how you survived years of cruelty without breaking, in how you see solutions where others see only impossible choices, in how you stepped forward when you had every reason to stay hidden. His scarred hands tightened around hers. You're not worthless. You never were. Mira felt tears burn behind her eyes. No one had ever spoken to her like this, not as an Omega, not as a rank or a role, but as a person whose worth was intrinsic and undeniable. I don't know if I can do this, she admitted. Neither do I, Garrick said, and the honesty of it, the lack of false promises or empty reassurance, steadied something inside her. But I know I'd rather face it with you than watch one more woman fail because she was chosen for strength that doesn't matter. They stood there in the lamplight, hands joined, marks pulsing in synchronization. For the first time since this began, Mira didn't feel like an Omega challenging an Alpha. She felt like an equal sharing a burden too heavy for either to carry alone. Outside, the moon's shield flickered. But in this moment, in this room, something else was building, something the prophecy hadn't mentioned, something no council could legislate or tradition could deny. Trust. Real, fragile, absolutely necessary trust. Tomorrow then, Mira said quietly. Tomorrow, Garrick agreed. Neither of them mentioned that tomorrow might be their last. Chapter 5. Dawn broke cold and sharp over the cliff face. The path of the ancestors clung to the mountainside like a scar, a narrow ledge of ancient stone that wound along sheer rock for nearly a quarter mile before reaching the ritual completion point. 300 feet below, jagged rocks waited with patient hunger. Mira stood at the path's beginning, the wind whipping her ceremonial robes and pulling at the braids someone had woven into her dark hair. The entire pack had gathered, lining the safe observation ridge, crowding the upper plateau, silent witnesses to what would either be salvation or catastrophe. Garrick stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. The moonfire brand on his forearm was already glowing, pulsing in rhythm with her hidden lunar key. She could feel him through the bond now, a constant presence at the edge of her awareness, his determination, his fear, the steel-core certainty he wore like armor. Stay close, he said quietly. Match my pace. Trust your instincts. Elder Thorn raised his staff. Begin the traversal. May the ancestors guide your steps. They moved as one. The path was barely wide enough for single file, forcing them to move in perfect synchronization. Garrick led, his warrior's balance making the treacherous footing look almost easy. Mira followed, her smaller frame and Omega-trained awareness letting her sense the subtle shifts in the stone before her feet found them. The marks blazed brighter with each step. Mira felt the change start in her chest, a warmth that spread through her limbs like liquid light. Her muscles shifted, gaining strength she'd never possessed, her stride lengthening to match Garrick's without conscious thought. She glanced at her hands and saw them outlined in faint blue luminescence. Ahead, Garrick stumbled slightly, something she'd never seen him do. He caught himself, but his movements had changed, become more careful, more precise. The brute strength she'd seen him carry was being tempered by something else. Something that felt like her caution, her awareness of danger. The marks are merging our strengths, Mira breathed, understanding flooding through her. Balancing us. Garrick looked back, and his eyes were ringed with the same blue glow. I can feel the stone like you do. Every crack, every weakness. Wonder and fear mixed in his voice. Is this what you sense all the time? And I have your confidence, Mira replied, amazed. The crippling self-doubt that had haunted her entire life had receded, replaced by a bone-deep certainty in her own capability. Your strength. They moved faster now, their combined abilities making the impossible path feel merely difficult. Where Garrick's power would have been too forceful, Mira's precision guided his steps. Where her caution might have frozen her, his courage kept them moving forward. The pack watched in awed silence as they crossed sections that should have taken hours in mere minutes. They were halfway when Mira felt the first wrongness. It came through her empathic senses first, a discordant note in the stone's ancient stability, like a crack in a bell's perfect tone. She slowed, her enhanced awareness screaming warnings she couldn't quite translate into words. Something's wrong, she said. Garrick stilled immediately, trusting her instinct without question. Where? Mira closed her eyes, letting the merged consciousness of their bond guide her. She could feel the path ahead, could sense the way the stone should hold together through centuries of earth magic woven into its foundation. But there was a gap now. A deliberate weakness. The anchor point, she whispered. Someone's tampered with it. The final ritual stone sat 50 feet ahead, carved with lunar phases and ancient pack symbols. It was the point where they would complete the traversal, where their marks would fully unite and either restore the moon's shield or destroy everything. And someone had sabotaged it. Garrick's rage burned through the bond like wildfire, but his voice stayed level. Can we reach it? Complete the ritual before it fails. Mira opened her eyes, studying the path ahead with her Omega-trained attention to detail now amplified by Garrick's warrior assessment. The anchor point was compromised, but not yet collapsed. They had minutes. Maybe less. We run, she decided. They exploded into motion. The marks burned white-hot now, their combined speed and precision turning the deadly path into something they could almost fly across. Mira's feet found holds she shouldn't have been able to see. Garrick's strength carried them across gaps that should have been impossible. They moved as a single entity, the bond between them singing with power and desperate hope. 30 feet from the ritual stone. The first anchor bolt gave way with a sound like breaking bones. 20 feet. A section of the path behind them crumbled, rock cascading down the cliff face in a roar of destruction. The pack's screams echoed across the canyon, but Mira couldn't look back, couldn't think about anything except reaching that stone. 10 feet. The entire cliff face shuddered. Mira felt the catastrophic failure building through her enhanced senses, not just the sabotaged anchor point, but the cascading collapse it would trigger. The path of the ancestors was about to take them with it. Garrick reached the ritual stone first, his hand slamming down on the carved surface. Mira, now. She lunged forward, her palm joining his on the ancient stone just as the world began to end. The cliff face exploded. Rock separated from mountain in a grinding roar that drowned out everything else. The ritual stone beneath their hands tilted sickeningly, the platform it sat on no longer attached to anything solid. Mira felt herself falling, felt Garrick's hand lock around her wrist with crushing strength. The marks detonated. Blue-white light erupted from where their palms pressed against the stone, so bright it turned the dawn into noon. Mira felt power surge through her unlike anything she'd imagined, Not just her own magic or Garrick's, but something infinitely greater. The combined force of the Moonfire and Lunar Key, finally united, finally complete. But they were still falling. The ritual stone broke free completely, tumbling into the abyss with them still clinging to it. Above, the pack's screams turned to raw panic. Below, the jagged rocks rushed up to meet them with terrible speed. Myra's wolf surged forward, overwhelming her human consciousness with instinct and power she'd never been allowed to express. She felt Garrick's wolf rise to meet hers, felt their marks fuse completely in that moment of absolute crisis. And then she heard herself roar. Not a human scream. Not even a normal wolf's howl. This was something primal and commanding, a sound that carried the weight of ancient magic and desperate fury. The sound of an Omega who had finally found her voice. The sound of the Lunar Key claiming its power. Time seemed to slow. Mira could see every detail, the crumbling cliff face, the falling debris, Garrick's terrified determination, the pack members above frozen in horror. She could feel the land itself through the bond, could sense the deep magic woven into this territory by generations of alphas and their true mates. And she understood, finally, what the Lunar Key could do. What she could do. If she was strong enough. If she didn't fail. Chapter 6. The impact knocked the air from Myra's lungs. She hit the ledge hard, rolling instinctively as debris rained around her. For a heartbeat, she couldn't process anything except pain and the deafening roar of collapsing stone. Then she realized Garrick wasn't beside her. Garrick. Her scream tore from her throat as she scrambled to her knees. The ledge they'd landed on, some mercy of geography or desperate magic, was barely 10 feet wide, jutting from the cliff face like a broken tooth. Above and below, rock continued to cascade in a deadly avalanche. She found him 20 feet away, half buried under a massive stone slab that had pinned his legs. Blood streaked his face, and the Moonfire brand on his exposed arm flickered weakly, like a candle in wind. Mira crawled toward him, her own body screaming protests. "Hold on, I'll get back." Garrick's voice was raw with pain and terror. "The whole section is going to..." The cliff face groaned, a sound like the earth's death rattle. Mira felt it through the bond, through her connection to the land, the next collapse building, exponentially larger than what had already fallen. This wasn't just the path of the ancestors anymore. The sabotage had triggered a catastrophic failure that would bring down half the mountain. Above them, the pack had scattered in panic. Wolves and humans fled from the cliff edge as cracks spider-webbed across the observation ridge. Mira caught a glimpse of Red Cloak among the chaos, Alara, standing perfectly still while others ran, her face lit with savage satisfaction. She'd won. Even if Mira and Garrick survived the fall, the ritual was incomplete, the bond unfinished. The moon shield would collapse. The pack would be destroyed. And Alara would be there to pick up the pieces. Something inside Mira snapped. Not broke, transformed. The part of her that had spent a lifetime being small, silent, invisible, shattered like old glass. In its place rose something that had been caged too long, something that had worn chains since birth and was finally, violently done. Her wolf. The shift took her without warning, her human form dissolving into fur and fang and ancient power. But this wasn't the normal transformation she'd experienced before. The lunar key mark blazed across her shoulder, visible through her silver-white coat, pulsing with the same blue light that had nearly completed the ritual. Mira threw back her head and felt the land answer her call. It came rushing into her consciousness, like a flood, every stone, every root, every crack and weakness and strength in the mountain. She could feel where the earth was stable, where it was ready to fail, where human sabotage had turned natural structure into a death trap waiting to spring. The next collapse would kill everyone. The pack on the ridge, Garrick beneath the debris, herself on this precarious ledge. Hundreds dead because one woman's ambition had poisoned what should have been sacred. Unless Myra's enhanced senses showed her something impossible. A single point of calculated pressure that would trigger a smaller collapse, one that would release Garrick but redirect the major debris flow away from the pack. It would require perfect timing, inhuman precision, and a voice powerful enough to literally move mountains. She'd never commanded anything in her life, but her wolf knew exactly what to do. Mira positioned herself at the critical point, her paws finding purchase on crumbling stone. Through the bond, she felt Garrick's confusion, his dawning understanding, his absolute terror not for himself but for her. "Trust me," she sent through the mark. Then she opened her jaws and roared. The sound that emerged wasn't anything that should come from a wolf's throat. It was the voice of the lunar key itself, ancient, undeniable, carrying the weight of prophecy and power that had slept for generations. It rolled across the mountain like thunder, like an earthquake-given voice, like the land itself crying out in fury and command. The stone answered. Myra's roar targeted the precise frequency, the exact pressure point where human sabotage met natural weakness. She felt the vibration travel through rock, felt it build and amplify, felt the mountain respond to the authority in her voice. The collapse came, but not randomly, not chaotically. Under her guidance, under the power of her commanding roar, the debris fell exactly where she directed it. The slab pinning Garrick shattered, smaller pieces cascading away as he dragged himself free. The major rock slide, the catastrophic failure that should have killed them all, veered sharply right, channeled by her precisely triggered minor collapse into an empty gorge where it could harm nothing but air and stone. On the ridge above, pack members scrambled back from the edge as cracks raced toward them, then stopped. Held. The controlled collapse had relieved enough pressure to stabilize the observation point. Myra's roar continued, reshaping disaster into salvation through nothing but wisdom and voice and the courage to finally claim her power. When silence finally fell, it was absolute. Garrick pulled himself upright, his legs bloodied but functional. He stared at Mira with an expression beyond words, awe and recognition, and something that looked like he was seeing her for the first time. The moonfire brand on his arm burned bright and steady now, no longer flickering. Above, the pack emerged from cover. The beta who had loosened the anchors stood frozen, his guilt written across his face as dozens of witnesses turned to stare. Beside him, Alara's satisfaction had curdled into ash-pale horror. Mira shifted back to human form, her body aching but whole. The lunar key mark at her collarbone blazed like a brand, visible to everyone now, undeniable. She'd hidden it her whole life. She was done hiding. The ritual isn't complete. Elder Thorn's voice drifted down, shaking but determined. The stone is here, Garrick said roughly. He lifted a chunk of the ritual stone from the debris, its carved lunar phases still intact despite the chaos. He held it toward Mira, his scarred hand steady. Finish it. Mira placed her hand over his on the broken stone. Their marks flared one final time, blue-white light exploding outward in a wave that made everyone shield their eyes. When the light faded, Mira felt it, the moon's shield, no longer flickering or dying, but blazing with renewed power. She could sense its boundary stretching around their territory, impenetrable and eternal, forged from the completed bond of moonfire and lunar key. From dominance and wisdom. From Alpha and Omega. From equals who had chosen each other despite every law that said they shouldn't. Garrick pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers. "You saved us," he whispered. "We saved each other," Mira corrected. Above them, the pack began to howl, a sound of celebration and relief, and the beginning of something new. All except Alara, who stood silent and calculating, already planning her next move. Every woman in the Crescent Moon Pack had failed the Alpha's challenge, each one dragging the moon shield closer to collapse, until a silent Omega whispered from the back of the hall. What would happen when the lowest-ranked wolf claimed what even the strongest betas could not earn? Chapter 7. The journey back to the Great Hall should have been triumphant. Instead, it felt like walking through a graveyard of trust. Pack members lined the corridors in silence, their faces showing the fracture that sabotage had carved into their community. Mira walked beside Garrick, acutely aware of how her enhanced senses now picked up every spike of fear, every pulse of residual terror from those who'd witnessed the mountain nearly claim them all. The beta who'd loosened the anchor bolts was already restrained when they arrived, his wrists bound with silver that burned against his skin. He wouldn't meet anyone's eyes, but his guilt radiated like heat from a forge. 2 guards flanked him, their expressions carved from judgment and barely restrained fury. Ilara stood separate from him, her red cloak somehow still immaculate despite the chaos. But Mira could feel the calculation behind her composed mask, the rapid assessment of options and outcomes that came from someone used to controlling the board. "Speak," Garrick commanded the beta, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. The Moonfire brand still glowed faintly on his forearm, pulsing with barely contained rage. The beta's composure shattered. "She said the Omega would doom us. That the prophecy guaranteed destruction if the marks failed, so better to force failure on our terms than let it happen during the ritual." His voice cracked. "She said it was mercy. That we'd be saving the pack." "Lies," Ilara said smoothly, but something in her tone rang hollow. "He's trying to deflect blame onto someone with the authority to." "I saw you pay him." The voice came from the shadows near the door. The servant who'd tried to poison Mira stepped forward, her face pale but determined. 3 nights ago, in the East Corridor. You gave him a purse of silver and told him exactly where to weaken the anchor bolts. And I saw you commission the poison, another voice added. A kitchen worker, then another, stepping forward with testimonies that built like stones in a cairn. Small moments witnessed by invisible people, Omegas and servants who Ilara had never thought to notice watching. The evidence was damning, irrefutable, and building with each witness who finally found the courage to speak. Garrick's hand moved to the blade at his belt. The motion was fluid, practiced, the movement of someone who'd executed traitors before. "Treason," he said, his voice gone cold and flat. "Attempted murder of your alpha and his mate. Sabotage that nearly destroyed the entire pack." Mira felt his intention through the bond, swift, brutal justice. The kind that sent a message to anyone else who might consider betrayal. She understood the logic. Respected it, even. But she also felt something else through their connection, the echo of his father's guilt, the weight of a 12-year-old boy watching death claim someone because politics and fear had overruled wisdom. She placed her hand on Garrick's arm, her lunar key mark blazing bright enough to cast blue light across both their faces. "Alpha," Mira said, her voice clear and carrying despite years of being taught silence. "The strength of the moon's shield is justice, not vengeance. She will face the council, but we do not start our rule with needless blood." Garrick's jaw clenched, every muscle in his body coiled for violence. Through the bond, she felt him war with instinct and duty, with the Alpha's need to protect through decisive force. "She tried to kill you," he said quietly, meant only for her ears. "Kill us both." "I know." Mira kept her hand steady on his arm, kept her mark blazing with power she was still learning to claim. "But if we execute her here, now, without trial or process, we become exactly what forced me to hide my mark for 20 years. We become the kind of leaders who value strength over wisdom." She turned to face the assembled pack, her voice rising. "The lunar key isn't just about power. It's about seeing what strength alone misses, that true justice requires patience, requires hearing all voices, requires building something better than what came before." The words settled over the hall like snow, quiet but transformative. Mira watched pack members process them, saw the shift from bloodlust to something more complex, more thoughtful. Garrick's hand slowly released his blade. He looked at Mira for a long moment, and she felt his respect flood through the bond like warm light. "Elder Thorn," he called, his voice still hard but controlled. "Convene the full council. Ilara of the Red Cloak will be tried for her crimes. Publicly. With every shred of evidence and testimony laid bare." Elara's composure finally cracked, rage flashing across her features before she schooled them back to neutrality. But it was too late. Everyone had seen. "We are not our father's pack," Garrick continued, addressing everyone now. "We are not a territory built on hidden marks and silenced voices. Justice will be served, but it will be served right." He took Myra's hand, their marks pulsing in synchronization. Together, he added quietly, looking only at her. Together, Myra agreed. Chapter 8. The arena had been hastily cleared of debris, but the scars of sabotage remained: cracked stone, displaced earth, the lingering taste of ash and fear in the air. The entire pack assembled as dusk fell, filling every available space with bodies pressed close in anxious anticipation. Above them, the moon's shield flickered like a dying heartbeat, its translucent barrier visible now in its weakness, shot through with hairline fractures that spread wider with each passing moment. Myra stood at the arena's center beside Garrick, acutely aware of every eye fixed upon them. The lunar key mark at her collarbone felt warm, alive, pulsing in rhythm with the moonfire brand on Garrick's forearm. Through their bond, she felt his steady certainty anchoring her own nervous energy. Elder Thorn raised his staff, his ancient voice somehow carrying across the assembled crowd. The ritual was completed in crisis, forged in falling stone and desperate hope. But tradition demands formal acknowledgement. Witnessed union. The pack must see what protects them. Garrick turned to face Myra fully, his scarred hands reaching for hers. She placed her palms against his, feeling the familiar heat of their marks recognizing each other. The connection between them had grown from tentative spark to roaring flame over the past days, no longer just magical necessity, but genuine partnership forged in trust and shared survival. "Ready?" he asked quietly, meant only for her. Together, Myra answered, the word becoming their promise. They closed their hands as one. The marks exploded with light. It started as blue-white brilliance between their joined palms, then erupted outward in an expanding wave that made everyone gasp and shield their eyes. Myra felt power surge through her unlike anything before, not just her own magic or Garrick's, but the combined force of prophecy fulfilled, of balance achieved, of two halves finally made whole. The light climbed skyward in a pillar that pierced the dying shield above. Where it touched the fractured barrier, cracks sealed instantly, weakness transforming into strength so profound it seemed to hum with barely contained energy. The pillar spread outward like roots seeking earth, racing along the shield's entire perimeter, knitting together every gap and flaw until the barrier blazed solid and impenetrable. Through the bond and her enhanced connection to the land, Myra felt the shield lock into place with an almost audible click, permanent, eternal, powered by something deeper than mere magic. Powered by the choice two people had made to value each other despite every tradition that said they shouldn't. When the light finally faded, the moon's shield gleamed above them like captured starlight, stronger than it had been in generations. The pack erupted in howls of celebration and relief, the sound building until it seemed to shake the very stones beneath their feet. Myra saw tears on faces hardened by years of warrior training, saw pack members embracing each other with the desperate joy of those who'd glimpsed annihilation and survived. Garrick squeezed her hands gently, then stepped back. The gesture was deliberate, significant, making space for her to occupy, granting her the platform she'd never been allowed. Myra's heart hammered, but she stepped forward. Her voice, so long trained to silence, rang clear across the arena. "For generations, we have measured worth by dominance. By who could fight hardest, command loudest, force others to submit." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the assembled pack. "That tradition nearly destroyed us. Not because strength is worthless, but because we forgot that strength alone is incomplete." She saw Elder Thorn nodding slowly, saw even some of the warrior betas leaning forward to hear better. "The moon's shield didn't fail because we lacked power. It failed because we valued only one kind of power and dismissed all others as weakness. Myra's hand moved unconsciously to her collarbone, to the mark that blazed visible for all to see. Omega Wisdom saw solutions that Alpha Force missed. Beta Strategy found paths that Raw Dominance overlooked. Every rank, every role, every voice we silenced, each one held pieces of what we needed to survive. She felt Garrick's pride through the bond, felt his absolute support anchoring her courage. From this day forward, the Crescent Moon Pack is led by utility, not hierarchy. Your worth is measured by what you contribute, not what rank you were born into. The Omega's knowledge, the Beta's tactics, the Alpha's protection, all equally valued, all equally necessary. Her voice strengthened. We are strongest when every voice is heard. When the invisible are finally seen. Silence held for 3 heartbeats. Then a single howl rose from the back, and Omega, young and trembling, but defiant in her joy. Another joined, then another, until the sound built into a chorus that spoke of hope and transformation and the terrifying, exhilarating possibility of becoming something new. Garrick moved to stand beside Mira, his hand finding hers naturally. Above them, the moon shield pulsed with power that would endure for generations. Below, a pack began learning what it meant to be whole. Chapter 9. The council chamber had changed over the past year. Where heavy ceremonial drapes once hung to separate ranks, wide windows now let in afternoon sunlight that warmed the polished stone. The rigid hierarchy of seating had given way to a circular arrangement where betas sat beside omegas, where a kitchen worker's insight on supply chains held equal weight to a warrior's assessment of border security. Mira sat beside Garrick at the broad oak table, reviewing the week's petitions with the methodical attention she'd once reserved for stretching meager kitchen supplies. Her simple dress had been replaced by formal robes that marked her as Luna, but she'd insisted they be practical, deep blue wool without excessive embroidery, designed for movement rather than display. The lunar key pendant rested openly against her collarbone now, its silver catching the light with each breath. 3 more packs requesting alliance, Garrick noted, sliding a stack of sealed letters across the table. They've heard about the judicial reforms. Want to learn how we resolved that border dispute without bloodshed? Word travels fast when you solve problems instead of just dominating them, Mira replied, scanning the first petition. A smile tugged at her lips. Though I suspect they're more interested in how we've maintained the strongest territorial shield in living memory. Through the windows, the moon shield was clearly visible even in daylight, a shimmering boundary of blue-white magic that pulsed with steady, unshakable power. Travelers from other territories claimed you could see it from miles away, a beacon of security that had transformed the Crescent Moon Pack from struggling survivors to the most sought-after alliance in the region. Garrick's hand found hers on the table, their marks flaring briefly in acknowledgement. The gesture had become unconscious over the months, constant small touches that kept their bond singing, that maintained the shield's strength through continuous connection rather than desperate ritual. Elder Thorn wants to establish a formal school, Mira continued, setting aside the alliance requests. Not just warrior training, but history, strategy, land management. He's proposing that Omegas teach alongside Betas. Approved, Garrick said immediately. Though he'll need to fight Senna for the history position. She's been cataloging the archives for months. Mira felt warmth bloom in her chest at how naturally he'd said it, no hesitation, no question of whether an Omega was qualified to teach. The casual acceptance of what had once been unthinkable still sometimes caught her off guard, still felt like discovering she could breathe deeper than she'd known was possible. A knock at the door interrupted them. "Enter," Garrick called. A young beta entered, carrying a long wooden case. "Alpha Luna." The craftsman finished the commission. Garrick stood, taking the case with careful hands. The beta bowed and departed, leaving them alone again. When Garrick turned back to Mira, his scarred face held an expression she'd learned to recognize, anticipation mixed with the particular vulnerability of offering something deeply personal. I had this made, he said simply, opening the case. Inside, nestled in velvet, lay a small wooden training sword. It was beautifully crafted, sized for a child's hand, with lunar phases carved along the blade and the Moonfire brand inlaid in silver on the hilt. Beside it rested a matching pendant, a miniature version of Myra's lunar key, small enough for an infant's throat. Myra's breath caught. Her hand moved unconsciously to her stomach, where the slight swell of early pregnancy had only recently become visible beneath her robes. We don't know yet if they'll carry a mark, Garrick said quietly, moving to kneel beside her chair. His hand covered hers on her belly, warm and steady. Or a witch mark. Or if they'll need either to be worthy. His dark eyes met hers with absolute certainty. But we know they'll be trained in every skill that matters, not just combat, not just wisdom, but balance. Choice. The freedom to become whoever they're meant to be. Their marks pulsed in synchronization, blue light briefly illuminating the space between their joined hands. Through the bond, Mira felt everything he couldn't quite articulate, his determination that their child would never carry the burden of impossible expectations, would never be forced to hide their nature or diminish their gifts, would grow up in a pack that measured worth by character rather than rank. We broke the curse, Mira said softly, wonder threading through her voice. Not just for us. For them. For everyone who comes after. You broke it, Garrick corrected gently. When you stepped forward. When you refused to stay silent. We broke it together, Mira insisted, the phrase that had become their truth. With every choice we made to value partnership over power. Outside, the moon's shield pulsed stronger, responding to the bond that sustained it. Through the windows, Mira could see pack members moving about their day, Omegas and Betas training together in the practice yards, council members of mixed ranks discussing policy, children playing without regard for the hierarchies that had once defined their parents' lives. A year ago, she'd been invisible. Now she sat at the center of transformation, her mark openly displayed, her voice carrying weight that reshaped centuries of tradition. Garrick lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles where her mark glowed faint and steady. Tomorrow, he said, making it both promise and question. Mira smiled, her free hand resting on the small life growing inside her, feeling the future pulse bright and certain as the shield that protected them all. Tomorrow, she agreed. And all the tomorrows after.